This is an interview for the Industrial Relations Society of New South Wales Oral History Project. The interviewee is Robin Amos, and I'm the interviewer, Judy Hughes. The date is the 30th of November, 2021. Welcome, Robin.
Thanks, Judy.
Can we start with your early influences in life, where you're from and a bit about your family background?
Okay, I come from a very strong Labor background. My father was a Boilermaker and was a very proud member of the Boilermakers and Blacksmiths Society, was very upset when they amalgamated with the AMWU. And I grew up in a house where we talked politics all the time and fairness, and I think he was a big influence on me in relation to my interest in workplaces generally. And then I suppose the second influence, when I started work in the Sydney County Council, I worked for one of the best industrial relations people I think I ever met, that guy called Brian Fallon. And he and the industrial officer, Ray Spratt, were really good negotiators. They listened, they dealt informally with the unions, off the record if you like, and then would sort things out and then go through the motions in a more formal sitting, which I always think is a good idea.
And so where did you grow up then and go to school?
I grew up, we started, when I was little, we lived in a terrace house in Surrey Hills, and there were a lot of, they were all tradesmen or waterside workers actually, so I grew up in a very working class area. And then my parents won a block of land in a ballot. They used to ballot Crown land, and we moved to Malabar, and I went to school back at Crown Street, back in Surrey Hills, and then Randwick Girls High School I finished my schooling.
And what sort of subjects were you interested in those days?
School, English and history. And when I was at school, I didn't realise you could go to university unless you had a scholarship, because everyone I knew who went to uni either had a teacher's college or Commonwealth scholarship. And I needed French to pass the leaving, it was called in those days, and I failed. So I didn't matriculate, so I couldn't go to uni, which used to really upset me as I went in the bus past the University of New South Wales going to business college. So the next best thing was become a secretary.
So was that your first job?
My very first job was with a firm of chartered accountants. I didn't last there very long because they weren't a good employer. And then I saw the job advertised at the Sydney County Council and applied and got the job there. And I worked in the staff office, it was called in those days. We dealt with all the employment matters. And then I was on the relief staff, and then I became secretary in the industrial relations section.
And what sort of training did you have to do for that job?
Just shorthand and typing. The really interesting thing in those days, in local government anyway, was because we had a skill, as in shorthand and typing, as juniors we actually got paid more than the boys did. But that soon changed at 21. We stopped where we were and they kept going.
And so what got you into industrial relations?
Working in the industrial section in the council, we coordinated a 35-hour week case for the electricity supply industry, and I was typing the submission, and I found it fascinating, and also just the issues that used to come up at work, and because I was doing all the typing, I could follow all the issues that arose in the workplace and how they resolved them, and I just found it fascinating and decided that was what I wanted to do. But when I said at work to the industrial officer that I wanted to do the IR certificate, he said to me, "Oh, Robin, IR's too hard for women to get into. You should do the personnel certificate." So I did for 12 months, and then I got a job with a union and transferred over to the IR certificate at Sydney TAFE. And then another influence there was a man called Albin Gillizo. And Albin did a lot of research with unions, and he was involved with the Industrial Relations Society, and frankly was the best recruiter they ever had, because I think everyone in my TAFE class joined the society, and he did it from talking to other people he did it with every class he had. You were studying industrial relations, you needed to join the Industrial Relations Society. He's a good man.
And why was that? Why did he say you needed to join?
Because we needed to be part of the industry. And since I've been known about this project, I've spoken to a lot of friends who were members of the society back in the 70s. And the thing that always comes through from everyone is they talk about camaraderie, friendships, networking. And it was a brilliant networking organisation, and it meant that you got to know the people on the other side. They weren't the other anymore. They were someone you might have had a beer with in the pub, or you might have gone to a conference with, and we got to know each other better. And it also meant that if you had a problem, there was a fair chance you'd find somebody who'd dealt with a similar issue. So it was really helpful, and they used to have a lot of workshops, and the big cases that would happen, they'd have people in and we'd sort of analyse the case and what had happened and how things had happened, and it was a good learning experience to be part of it all.
And how did the job with the union come about?
Well, a friend I was working with at the council told me that his friend had been made union secretary and was looking for somebody who could do secretarial work but a bit more. And he said to me, I think you'd be ideal. So I was interviewed for the job in the PSA club, in the bar at the PSA club, and which was an unusual experience for me. And I was successful and got the job. So I started out as a research officer, which I think many women in the union movement did. It was your foot in the door. That it was industrial relations back in the 70s was a very male environment, very blokey, and it was hard for women to get in. So as a research officer, that was sort of an acceptable thing for women to do. And then huge numbers of women, of course, went on, became industrial officers, became union secretaries, became commissioners.
I asked you, how did you join the union? And if you can say the name of the union in your answer would be great.
Oh, all right. Yes, so I was interviewed for the job with the Australian Shipping Officers Association in the bar of the PSA club in Sydney, with the barman, who was a good friend of the union secretary, interjecting as well and offering a few comments along the way. It was one of the strangest interviews I think ever conducted, but it was successful.
And your work at the union, what did that involve?
It involved a lot of research. Our union used to serve a log of claims every 2 years. So one year we'd have a conference with all our councillors from the various states. We'd sit down over a week, work out the things that we were going to put in the log of claims. I used to attend those meetings. I used to do the minutes for them on a daily basis. So I'd sit in the meeting all day, go out for dinner and a few drinks at night, then type up the minutes and give it to them the next morning. It was very full on, but I was always involved in everything. So it was the benefit of working in a very small union. We only had 4 staff, so we all pitched in and did everything, and I was never excluded from any of the discussions or anything. So it was interesting, and in those days we used to get all the updates from the Commission. Every variation of every award, every union got a copy, and I used to go through those and we'd just check what anybody else had added to their award, and we'd just throw it in our log of claims as well, which led to some interesting discussions with the employers panel. I remember one time that guy from the Employers Federation said, "Where on earth did this come from?" And I said, "Oh, it was in, I'll say, the Painters Award." And he said, "What's that got to do with you?" And I said, "Well, nothing, but they've got it, so we want it." And we got a lot of things like that.
And what was it like for women in the union movement in those times?
It was pretty tough. You had to be strong, I think, in any area of industrial relations. Like the New South Wales Society started in 1958. the first woman on the committee as Assistant Secretary was Viv Reid, and that was in 1976. So it took 18 years for them to put someone on the committee, and then it took a further 20 years until 1996 when I became the first female president. So it was an overwhelmingly male environment, and you had to be able to cope with that. They weren't nasty and they didn't exclude you, but it was, you could feel the testosterone in the room all the time. It was very much like that, and it led to interesting situations where I was sent to a meeting with all the waterfront unions. I was the only woman in the room, and the minister came in, did a double take, and then continued all the way through the meeting saying, "Lady and gentlemen," which I found really quite embarrassing because every time he said it, a large number of men would turn around and look at me as if I was an interloper. And it happened at another function I went to with the Australian National Line. It was, I think, their 40th anniversary dinner. And it was a very formal dinner in a big hotel, in the Regent Hotel in Sydney. And when I got out of the lift, some men near the lift turned around and looked at me and said, "Well, she's in the wrong place." Didn't accept that I might have been there as a guest. So you had to be prepared to wear those sorts of things. And I think the women who were involved in IR early on were really strong characters, and we were working in an era where it was really sexist in the workplace. And I was thinking the other night when I got married, one of the men at work said to me, "So you're married now, when are you going to give up your job for a single woman?" And I looked at him, I said, "The same day you give up your job for a married man," because he was single. And it was just the way it was. So there was a lot of resentment building up over time for when women got involved. And then I think the big increase in women in IR or in the society came about when companies did away with having a separate industrial relations manager and a personnel manager and merged them into HR managers. And whilst the men were brilliant at what they did in industrial relations, in the combined job they usually didn't have any other skills. So more women were starting to be successful in being employed as HR managers. And we got a big influx of women members, but they weren't coming to any of the functions. So we started asking around and we found that they were intimidated by the functions that we were running because there'd be half a dozen women and maybe 50 or 60 men. So we started running some women in IR functions so that they could meet each other and benefit from the networking. And one of my friends was outraged, and he actually resigned from the society because we started running these discriminatory functions. His point was, "We've never been discriminatory, so why are you starting now?" So it was interesting times.
And did women in industrial relations support each other? Did they band together in that environment?
Yes. We in the union movement at one stage we tried to get a women in IR group going, just so that we could meet each other, and again as a networking opportunity. But unfortunately, factional politics got involved, and I was told by a senior woman in the right wing that I should be very careful because the left was going to take it over. And I said to her, "There's nothing to take over. We're just meeting to have a drink and getting to know each other." But factions, of course, always came up in unions. And I think it was interesting that in big companies it's much easier to recruit because management is very remote, often in a different building or a different state, and it's easy to unite people against management because they're the other and they're the enemy. It's really hard to recruit in white-collar areas because quite often they're smaller businesses. The owner or manager is working with the staff and they're really nice people. And people feel disloyal then if they join a union. So it was hard recruiting in the white-collar areas, I think.
And what about in the society? What was the sort of breakdown of the membership in the early years, and did it change over time?
Or I think in the early years it was certainly overwhelmingly male. In fact, in the early journals, JIRs, at the on the page where it was described the society, it said applicants for membership had to be nominated by 2 financial members who had to personally know him. It wasn't them, it was him. So there was an expectation it would only be men. And I think probably around the mid-70s when things started to change, but it would still have been a very small proportion of the membership that were female. As I said, it increased enormously when HR managers came onto the scene, and then even more so when more legal firms got involved, a lot more women lawyers. And a lot of them had come from straight IR firms as well.
And what sort of leadership, you mentioned some of the leadership positions you held. What did you try to achieve once you actually got into a leadership position with the society?
I suppose the women in unions functions was one of the things we achieved. I can't think of anything in particular that we tried to do. I used to organise the conferences for 10 years, and that was always an interesting exercise because traditionally we'd always invited politicians, despite the fact most people thought they were a waste of time. But we'd invite the minister and the shadow minister, federal and state, and quite often, depending on who was in government, the Labor members generally or always came, or if the minister or spokesperson couldn't come, they would send somebody else. But quite often you'd have to ring up the Liberal member's office and say to the staff, "Oh, just letting you know the opposition is going to come to the conference," and that often resulted in them deciding that perhaps they might come along. So it was, I think the big thing about the society that I've always thought was one of its strengths was the way we went out of our way to balance all the various areas of IR. And in New South Wales, each of the groups, so employers, unions, academics, lawyers, took turns in being president. So it was a rotation basis, and each time there was an election, a person from that grouping would be nominated for president. And it was so that one group didn't take control of everything. And I think when you look at I saw a copy of the first JIR, and I was impressed at how many union people were involved right from the beginning, because by the time I joined the society, there weren't a lot of unions were involved, which I always felt was a shame. And they just decided that they didn't want to be part of it all. Some people find problems where there's none exist.
And what was happening in your own career at that time? You joined the union as a research officer. What happened from then?
Then I became an industrial officer because I very cleverly, there was a scheme on in the government was running, encouraging employers to put on young people, and there was a wage subsidy attached. So I convinced our secretary to put on a young girl to do the typing and everything, and that meant I could move out of the secretarial work and get more involved in the industrial work. So I did quite a bit in the commission, and the benefit of being in a small union was that I got to do a lot of things I wouldn't have ever got near in a big union. So when we decided we wanted to cover the travel industry, I was in charge of the negotiations for that, which was interesting because they didn't want to have anything to do with us. And I was told that the head of AFTA, the Federation of Travel Agents, had said he'd keep throwing money at a lawyer until I went away. But wiser heads prevailed, and we talked, and we did get an award. And then when Industry Super came about, I was also able to set up an industry superannuation fund for primarily people in the travel industry, and then the shipping companies then started putting their junior staff in it as well, because some of them had very generous defined benefit funds and were realising how much money was being put away for people's superannuation. So it was good working for a small union because I was exposed to so many more things. I wasn't stuck in a box like I would have been in a big organisation.
And where did you go from there?
I left the union we amalgamated with the Australian Services Union in 1993, and things were changing in IR, and I wasn't terribly happy. And then with all the amalgamations, we'd pulled in so many unions that we were overstaffed, and they offered voluntary redundancies, so I decided to take one. And then I set up my own company, which I called Win-Win Solutions. And I got that from my daughter because she worked in a club, and she was complaining about the union they were dealing with one day, and she said to me, you know, I wish we had someone like you in the union because you always look for the win-win solution. And so when I set up the business, I thought that was a good name because it is my philosophy. I don't think you get anything by trying to paint your opposition in a corner. You just make them come out fighting. So I did that, and because I wasn't used to being responsible for my own income, I also took a part-time job at the State Chamber of Commerce as an advisor, and that was a good job too. And all of the advisors we all had a union background, or one had a very friendly employer to the union background, and it was good. We could help people and deal with all the issues that came about. And then in 2001, for various personal reasons, I decided I needed a regular income, and I saw the job advertised in the New South Wales Department of Industrial Relations for a workplace advisor, and applied for that. And I was there 10 years, and I finished up as manager of workplace advice. So I suppose the thing that's always been my ambition in my workplace has been to help people. And I think that's what's kept me in industrial relations. I've basically never worked in anything else. So, and then I took another voluntary redundancy from the department when there was a change of government, and I thought because of the work we did that the Liberal government would get rid of us, but they didn't. But I took the redundancy anyway. So.
And in that particular role, what sort of inquiries did you get from the public? What can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. When I first started, we used to get lots of complaints, basically about underpayments, not paying overtime, meal money, all sorts of things. And it was interesting because the first question I always had was, are you a member of your union? And most people weren't. And we were starting to get a lot of people saying, oh, no, I left the union. I was a member for years, but they stopped listening. They're not listening to what we want. And this was when enterprise bargaining was in its full flush. And I think that was a problem. Enterprise bargaining, I think, made it very hard for unions to keep servicing their members the way they had been. It was all right for unions that had thousands of members in one place, but for unions whose membership was spread broadly, it was very difficult to stay on top of things. We used to run workshops on, one of our favourite ones was rights and responsibilities, which I think is still something that so many people today are so full of all their rights, but they don't accept that along with the right there comes a responsibility. So we did that. We used to do managing employees. We did workshops on recruitment. They were usually small business people, but we were just trying to help people. So I was perfectly comfortable in that job as well, because we were trying to assist employers in managing their staff, trying to teach them that unfair dismissal laws didn't mean they had to keep on incompetent people, that they could sack people, they just had to go through a proper process. And we spent an awful lot of time doing that, I think, over the time I was there.
But you've had a number of different careers in industrial relations. What do you think makes industrial relations a good career for a young person?
I think people who have a strong sense of justice, people who, and this applies on either side of the divide, whether you're employer or union representative, people who want to help people who want to make things better, people who have a strong social conscience, I think, are drawn to industrial relations. But industrial relations today is very different from when I started working in it, because with work choices and then the Fair Work Act, the acts were so different and so new that we needed lawyers to start interpreting it. But then again, I think in my experience, too many cases got bogged down in the legal technicalities of what was actually meant, and the people were starting to be forgotten. And it's become a very legalistic field. You know, I don't think I would have been able to get any of the jobs I held today without a law degree. Whereas when I did it, you didn't need the law degree. If you had a real problem, then you went to the lawyers. And I think because we were all more directly involved, we probably had a different attitude to the work. That, as a friend of mine said, as the industrial relations manager, if he went to the commission and the company won and the employees lost something, he was the one who had to go back to work the next day and face all the anger from everyone because they lost something. Too, I think that also helped in those days for people to know each other and work together and try and come up with a compromise. I think the key to negotiation is pointing out what's in it for the other side. So if you can say, I want this, but you will gain that, people are much more amenable than if you just go in like a bulldozer saying, this is what I want and I don't care. It's a more conciliatory sort of approach.
And have there been any particular people in industrial relations who've been important to you or mentors?
As I said, the very first man I worked for, Brian Fallon, was a wonderful example of how to operate in an industrial relations environment. He's a very, very good man. And the senior industrial officer in the council, Ray Spratt, was very thorough and was usually very careful, although they did put out a memo once. People were coming back from holiday, men were coming back from holidays with very scruffy beards. And a memo went out saying beards shall not be grown during working hours. And I saw it. I didn't realise the industrial relations manager was behind me, and I started to laugh. And one of the guys said, what are you laughing at? And I said, what are they saying? You can't grow your beard during working hours. What are you all going to do? Rush out to the toilet every 10 minutes and have a quick shave? So it was changed, and the amended version said that if you were going to grow a beard, you had to be off work at least 2 weeks, and it had to be a beard, not stubble, when you came back to work. But I thought that was funny.
And there's some big characters in industrial relations. Do you remember any of those?
It's hard to just pick a couple, I think. I know the people I took notice of initially was the secretary of the society, Owen Boland, and he seemed to know everyone and everything. And he I think was a great networker, and he was responsible for the conferences as well. When I first joined the society and Owen was secretary, the conferences were held up in Bathurst, and we used to have a private train that would go up to Bathurst, and they would get 600 people to the conference. And the train was really pretty well necessary because IR people work hard and play very hard as well. So it was a sobering time to come back on the train. But I admired, as our barrister, I admired Jeff Shaw enormously. He was, I thought, a brilliant barrister, and he would explain what he was going to say. He would say it and then he would explain what he'd said. And he represented us in a number of our cases. And in fact, when we were seeking coverage of the travel industry, he was our barrister, and the clerks union were fighting us, saying that travel agents were really clerks. And I can still see Jeff in the commission saying to Colin Politis, who was on the bench, "Well, Your Honour, you and I both use a pen in our job, but you would hardly say we were clerks." And Politis, madly shaking, he said, "No, of course not." And he nodded and shook his head as Jeff took him through why they really weren't clerks. They were specialist people who needed a union that would, cover them in their specialist field.
And industrial relations obviously changed a lot over the years. How has the society changed with it, and what do you think its future is?
I think the society is going more broadly into employment issues generally. I think there are a lot of us traditionalists who will always call it the Industrial Relations Society, but I think the remit of everybody working in that sort of area now in employment is much broader. And I think, and certainly there are a lot more women involved in this broader field. It's more employee or employment relations, and I think that's widened the area of people who could join. And I don't know, maybe still calling it the Industrial Relations Society might make some people feel uncomfortable with that, but it'll always be the IRS to me.
Okay, and well, we're about at the end. Is there anything we've missed that you'd like to talk about?
I can't think of anything, Judy. The other thing I would say is the JIR, particularly when I first joined the society, was a huge learning tool, and it's always been very highly respected industrial relations journal. And there were often really good articles, and again, analysis of various cases. There was always a review of cases that had happened through the year, national wage things. There weren't a lot of women's issues. In 1979, they put out a consolidated index of all the articles in the JIR from 1958 to 1979. And when I looked through it in that period of time, in 21 years, there were 10 articles relating to women, and it was and most of them were about either unemployment or underemployment of women. So we didn't rate very highly in the stakes. Whereas I looked at the last issue of the JIR that came out recently, and the entire issue is devoted to gender-based things and women's issues, which I thought was a complete turnaround. So we got a whole issue to ourselves.
That's great. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thanks, Robin.
Thanks, Judy.